3.
Welcome to all our comrades around the world to the Socialist Sunday stream.
Welcome everybody to the Socialist Sunday stream. We have Paul and Katie with us, and we have an extra Paul today. So we got.
It's not confusing at all.
We have our usual Paul, who we decided to call Pablo, compadre.
Hello, I am Pablo today, apparently.
And Kathrin from Kathrin's YouTube channel. Say hi, say hi.
Hey.
And we have Paul from Red Plateau, one half of the Red Plateau crew. Say hi and introduce yourself to these people who don't know what your project is about, and tell us all about it, please.
Okay, yeah. Hi, I am the guest Paul, as it were. I'm half of Red Plateaus, so what I do is I write the scripts and I record the audio. My comrade Ivan, he does basically everything else. Everything to do with like technology, editing, video making, these sorts of things. Basically what our YouTube channel does is we take certain aspects of Marx's work that aren't, we feel, well like covered or introduced or well explained elsewhere, especially on YouTube, and we try to explain them in as clearly as we can, briefly and sort of to the point, while at the same time as we're showing you what he says in the original text, at least in good English translations, and explaining the basis for the interpretations that we have. So in other words, explaining Marx at sort of a very basic level, but really quite sort of rigorously and in some depth, but not too much. I think that's it. The overall project isn't just to explain Marx, it's to go into various strands of socialist ideas, including strands of syndicalism and anarchism, and confederalism and a few others. So we have one recent video on prefigurative politics, and we're going to follow that up with a video that we finished recording, but we haven't made a video out of it yet, which is going to be on the various arguments for and against taking state power.
That sounds interesting.
Fantastic.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
So
Very interested in that.
You people are doing like the people's work. That's fantastic.
And you've also written a book, right, about all about prefigurative politics.
I'm sorry, I only heard a fragment of that. Did you?
Yeah, cut out a little bit.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was just mentioning that you also wrote a book about prefigurative politics, thinking about writing another book at the moment, right?
So
I
if
think I was able to
I heard
piece that
that
together.
correct,
The book,
is my
right?
audio not good?
Yeah, it's a bandwidth
Book,
issue,
yes.
I guess.
It's the bandwidth with the pandemic and everything. Yeah, there's not enough bandwidth to go around. We're running out of internets.
Oh,
Getting
no.
infected by corona. But I think what you meant to say is with the subject, the one of the subjects that we wanted to deal with today was prefigurative politics, right? And we saw that video that you did that was fantastic about, which is like in a way it's kind of a fancy word to describe like the very least attractive and less spectacular things that happen in a revolutionary process that have nothing to do with the revolt, right? It's like all the groundwork that we need to do before we start like the spectacle of violence and takeover and transformation, right?
Yeah, I guess that's one way of looking at it. It's also, I think, one of the things that I think is important to emphasize is exactly the sort of positive aspect of sort of meaningful socialist transition, right? It isn't, so the negative aspect is often taken to be, we need to replace or get rid of certain institutions that make us unfree, unequal, etc., like capitalism. And the positive aspect of that is, well, what do we put in its place? And I think prefigurative politics is one kind of systematic reflection on what we need to be able to do to achieve meaningfully different institutions than the ones we have.
In a way, it's kind of connected with the anarchist concept of dual power structures.
Yeah, exactly. So in socialism, one of the old terms for prefigurative politics was they would talk in terms of coherence between means and ends. So you see that in the Marxist tradition in people like Pannekoek, Horter, and so on. And you also see that very much in the anarchist side as well. So like Malatesta, Bakunin, Goldman, etc. The term prefigurative politics was first, as far as we know, first like properly used to refer to this concept by a guy called Carl Boggs. He wrote 2 articles in 1977 where he essentially takes a word that exists, namely prefiguration, and slaps it onto this pre-existing concept that in the past socialists used different words for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, that's really, really interesting and really, really insightful take into it. But I think we might have jumped the gun a little bit. Just for anybody who's watching, should we just briefly talk a little bit about what prefigurative politics is? Maybe just a couple of brief examples of prefigurative politics, maybe in the modern world, historically, etc. Do you wanna maybe take that, Paul? You have written a book on this, so I think you're the expert.
Yeah, I can certainly try.
Great, thanks.
So there are a few different definitions of it, right? But the kind of loose basic idea is the following. If we want to have a certain kind of like large-scale social change, we want fundamentally different kinds of institutions than the ones we have now. And in our current society, we don't already have other institutions that are organized roughly like that. Then we ourselves need to develop the kinds of practices and social relations in the here and now so that we'll be able to generalize them and use them to take over and transform our basic institutions in the future. So in other words, if you think that we want a future socialist society that's meaningfully free, where power flows from the bottom up, and you also think that in our existing society, things aren't organized like that, then the argument is if we want to go from where we are now to that kind of future, we need to make sure that at least some of our organizations and some of our institutions are organized in free and democratic ways, in ways where power flows from the bottom up, etc. And the basic argument is that only by doing this will people be able to learn how to govern institutions and how to run institutions, do practical problem solving, etc., in these new kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really, and I think that one of the examples you gave in your video was with unions as well. Wasn't that? I think that you said that people would get into unions, they would realize the power of making these decisions collectively, and that would sort of push them to go a little bit further, maybe. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, so there are a number of various ways in which people advocate doing this, right? And one of the classic examples is in unions. So there's a standard kind of like liberal way of organizing unions, which is very top heavy. You vote for a very sort of central union leadership that basically runs the whole institution from the top down. And one of these sort of classic syndicalist and also anarchist critiques of that, and they're often not exclusive, many anarchists are also syndicalists and vice versa, is precisely that if you organize in that way, fine, you might be able to win reforms, you might be able to defend effectively, but not only will you have a less effective union fighting for the interest of the working class than if you organize in more bottom-up ways, but you'll also not develop an institution that's able to take us from the system we have now to a meaningfully different, like a meaningfully free socialist society, because it's failing to practice the kinds of institutions we need for the future. It's failing to educate ourselves in becoming the kind of revolutionary agents we need to become to bring that kind of future about. Does that make sense? There are other organizations other examples as well, right? Like community organizations and so on.
Mm-hmm. And how would this fit into or work alongside Marxism? Because I guess that there's a lot of critiques from a lot of Marxists that don't really believe in prefigurative politics, but it seems from your videos you talk a lot about Marxism. So you must see a lot of the benefits of Marxism and anarchism and prefigurative politics. And how do you think that they all can sort of work together?
Yeah, the history here is fairly complicated, actually. So there are strands of Marxism that have embraced various forms of prefigurative politics for essentially Marxist reasons, like rooted in Marxist theory of praxis. There's a fact that's often forgotten here, which is that most of the anarchist and the sort of left-wing syndicalist movements, they basically operate with the same theory of praxis that Marx has. And to varying extents, they're aware of this. So Bakunin is extremely well aware of this. He'll point out that, yes, he agrees with Marx on the political economy and essentially on what you might call his philosophy, his theory of praxis, but he disagrees on other things. He disagrees with what Bakunin thinks is Marxist authoritarianism, which I think is mostly wrong about. And he also disagrees with what it takes to be Marx's theory of history, which I also think he gets wrong. The history of most Marxist movements, so in the Social Democratic Second International and in the Revolutionary Third International, is also quite complicated because there's an official doctrine which typically rejects prefigurative politics, so like Kautskyite social democracy, for example. But there's also massive strands within those movements, within, for example, the German Social Democratic Party, that do advocate prefigurative politics in various forms and that criticize the Kautskyite approach for these reasons in various ways. People like Rosa Luxemburg, who I mentioned, Anton Pannekoek, who was the head of the party school for a long time, and also a brilliant astrophysicist. There's a fun fact. So in the University of Amsterdam, there's, I think, an observatory. There's part of the university that's named after Anton Pannekoek because he basically brought like sort of astrophysics to the Netherlands. And among other things, wrote a really good history of astronomy. But he was also head of the party school in Germany for some time. And he's one of the main advocates of this within second and later third international Marxism. So the history here is actually very complicated, but many of the like official sort of more, what often get called the more orthodox strands do reject it. But that's, I think, starting to change now. So my impression is that there are large swathes of Marxists who are embracing various forms of prefigurative politics, often without being aware of their roots in certain left-wing strands of Marxism or in anarchism or in syndicalism. So there are philosophers like István Mészáros has written in some detail about why, from Marxist perspective, we need prefigurative politics, although he doesn't use that term, in order to transition to a free socialist society. That's filtered down into later things that are called 21st century socialist thinkers, so people like Martha Harnacker, Michael Leibowitz, and so on. And in a bunch of people around sort of Monthly Review, you can find them discussing what effectively are concepts of prefigurative politics from a very, very clearly Marxian perspective. And I think there's kind of a growing consensus, even though Marxist anarchists disagree on loads and loads of other things, like how to deal with the state, for example. I think there's growing agreement about the necessity for some sort of prefigurative politics, not only in, for example, 21st century socialist ideas, but also in certain strands of neo-Maoism, which I'm not super familiar with, but the ones I've talked to seem very much to embrace aspects of prefigurative politics, and so on. So the history here is complicated, and different emphases are also, and the different terminologies can often be quite confusing. But I think there's, like I said, a growing consensus that some form of this is needed, regardless of sort of which strand you identify the most with.
Yeah, that was you mentioned Maoism and stuff like that. There, I'm thinking specifically about the Black Panther Party, in the U.S. and like their feeding, their programs where they would like feed kids, before schools and stuff like that. And there was definitely prefigurative politics within that movement, but I don't know if they ever identified it as such, which in many ways reminds me of sort of in a lot of Marxist thought how things like intersectionality have been incorporated into a lot of Marxist thought, but they often do it without using the words, so there seems to be some hesitancy with using some of these terms and using this terminology within more orthodox strands of Marxism. So yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Maybe even if Katie or Javi want to chime in a little bit.
Well, I can answer the terminology thing straight away, right? So of course, most of the historical discussions don't use the term prefigurative politics, which is one issue, right? So the Black Panther Party were founded when, I want to say 66? Is that it?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
And of course, that's before the term prefigurative politics
Oh yeah, that was in the 70s.
The concept, because that was in
That's
1977 right. by Karl Boggs. And of course, when it gets slapped on, it's part of Karl Boggs' new left critique of Stalinism and Maoism in particular. And it's quite a strong critique, right? So I think in many people's minds, the term prefigurative politics and much of the ideas get identified with a bunch of other anarchist commitments like rejecting taking state power, as well as with sort of the negation or critique of Marxism or the kinds of Marxism that they strongly identify with. And I think that's part of the reason why also some Marxists, I think there's a certain amount of strategy here. When they start discussing effectively prefigurative politics, they often avoid using that terminology. And they often also avoid talking about the history or the sort of long further back history of these ideas in the Marxist and non-Marxist socialist movements. And I think in some respects, because very often these are extremely well-read people, I think that's partly a strategic move. I think because one of the projects that Ivan and I have, and also myself and my co-author of the book, which is called Prefigurative Politics, one of the projects we have is trying to bring together and synthesize some of the best ideas that can be found in both Marxist and anarchist traditions. And if we want to be able to do that, we can't sort of avoid the terminology. We have to explain it and explain why we're making the choice we're making and so on. So like I said, I think for many movements, the terminology that we have now didn't exist. So it makes sense why they didn't employ it. For some later thinkers, I think it might be a strategic move just to avoid confusing what they're arguing for with slightly distinct arguments, and to avoid certain kind of knee-jerky reactions that people can sometimes have, because that's a natural human response often, especially in heated ideological debates. Whereas for us, this isn't an option, right? Because me and my co-author, when we wrote the book, me and Ivan, when we're doing the channel, we can't do this for two reasons. One, the terminology very much exists now and has for some time. And the second reason is, of course, that we want to bring these ideas together explicitly in certain ways. And to do that, we need to explain the various terminology that various groups and thinkers use, and explain why they share certain things in common, why certain arguments they also share in common, etc.
I think that it's a very online left type of thing to do, and also like probably, I don't know, better that relating to academic circles, because I'm very far away from those. But once you're on the ground, once your boots on the ground and you're doing the work, kind of the term seems useful, and the distinction disappears. Like we are when you start doing the work, when you start working on those replacing those institutions that have failed in the current state of affairs, and when you're adapting it to your local circumstances, and when you're, as you were saying, taking a page from this book, a page from that book, and adapting everything to what needs to be done in every locale, in every space and time and circumstance, those differences really vanish. I think those differences exist only on paper. Of course, there'll be people who would like to put together a state or whatever, but there will be people who would like to put some democratic balances to that state as it should be. So if you're at this point in time in the 21st century, if you're prize yourself to be some kind of a leftist, I think those differences, that bickering about the term, which is, I find the term very useful, prefigurative politics, about what if it's real or if it's not, and if it needs to be done and needs not to be done. I would say it's like 14-year-old kids LARPing very hard, like the motherfuckers they are, who don't know shit about shit, who haven't put boots on the ground and done the actual work, who haven't cleaned up shit, who haven't done turns at the bar to finance projects, who haven't done any work for actual working projects to subvert the system and create when you subvert the system and you find yourself after that moment with nothing to replace it, you're gonna fail like a motherfucker anyway. So I don't know what you people think.
I agree. I think that a lot of this stuff can be very online. I think that you get I don't know. I don't want to target any specific people, but you'll have certain people saying, that's not real socialism. They get very dogmatic. They'll say this isn't the right way, this isn't the right path, and so we can't even sort of talk about these issues. They're sort of gated off because you're using a certain word. Certain sections of the left, if you use the term intersectionality, or if you mention identity politics, they'll just shut you off straight away. Certain sections of the left, if you say prefigurative politics, they'll shut you out straight away. Certain sections of the left, if you say state power, centralization, they'll just shut you off straight away. So it is that kind of very online thing. But in real life, like when you're actually organizing, actually, as you said, boots on the ground, you don't have that shit. But nobody's worried about that. But one of the things that I do want to sort of push forward with this is how we think that in terms of that boots on the ground approach, in terms of actually moving forward with this, taking it out of the academy and bringing it into the streets, bringing it out into the working class, bringing it out to normal people. Do the three of you, can you think of any good uses of this, good examples of how we can apply this in positive ways within our own forms of organization? Opening that up to anyone who wants to jump in.
I would say
Nobody?
any kind of dual power structures. I was letting some space so people could talk. I don't talk too much. I hate talking too much. I talk too much, and I don't want to talk that much. Anyway, any example of dual power structures? It's like the state is not providing for the people in this or that area. Like people are starving. Let's do a food bank. People are homeless. Let's set up a squat and set up like social living spaces. Let's take them away from say fucking Blackstone or whatever vulture funds with entire buildings on their property. If the police is corrupt and shit, let's get people with weapons on the streets and protect the people from police abuse. Basically, if anything, replacing the shit that don't work in the state, that doesn't serve the people, that would be any of those would be a form of prefigurative politics, I would say. But yeah, you can call them dual power structures, and none of the terms cancel each other. I guess there is some nuance there, and Red Paul, you can tell us more about that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things there, but okay, so I guess three things stand out for me sort of just as initial thoughts, right? So I guess one thing about the book is we didn't actually write it kind of for academics. I mean, we sort of tried to write it for normal people. If we were writing mainly for academics, we would have made a number of different choices than the ones we actually made when writing the book. I mean, we sort of are academics, so we're sort of still affected, sadly, by our social position. But we mainly try to write it in a way that would be useful for people who are interested in it from a political perspective. Academics tend to take a bunch of weird approaches to prefigurative politics. The history of how certain words or concepts developed, getting lost in going down rabbit holes of how exactly to define freedom. Here are 5 concepts of freedom and the arguments for and against them, these kinds of things. And we very deliberately avoided getting into those things because we felt they're a distraction to what's useful, or rather a distraction. They would be a distraction from doing what we think is important to do with that book, right? Which is to explain what these kinds of politics are like, what the main arguments are for and against them, and connect them to some important sort of ongoing contemporary debates, like debates about intersectionality, for example. In terms of how movements can use this, I mean, it depends on what they are, right? But so 3 things I think mainly. One is, one example is just think about how you organize decision making internally to an organization or to a movement. Like we have existing models of this that, for example, representative states use, right? We vote for a small number of people, give them almost complete power within some sort of rule-bound specificities that are harder to change, like the equivalent of a constitution or a basic set of principles. And then we trust them to do whatever they want for a certain number of years. And then eventually we get to vote in another group of people. And there are different ways of organizing this. But one of the downsides is that it tends to take power and initiative away from the average members of the organization. It tends to reduce the initiative of local units, and it tends to lead to de facto an oligarchical structure of the organization. That is, you tend to have organizations that are de facto run and controlled by a small minority of their members. And there are standard ways of trying to deal with this that often sort of get ignored, which is make as many decisions as possible on the local level, or at least as many as it's feasible and practical to do by voting directly, normally. When you do send people to sort of higher level assemblies of various kinds, you mandate them. So in other words, you give the unit or the local section that they're supposed to represent are told what they can and cannot do, what they given instructions that they have to follow. They are subject to immediate recall. So if they don't do what you want, you can immediately get rid of them. And you rotate them frequently to avoid, again, a single unit, say us, our group, getting dependent on sending just one person to the higher level assembly all the time, so that only they end up knowing what they're doing, know how to do this stuff. And these are things that Marx and Bakunin both praise about the Paris Commune, for example. Another thing which I think feeds into your point about dual power, right? It's worth thinking about which institutions would be most useful for running society in a much more democratic, in a much more free and equal way. And one of the standard answers is we need to organize both according to local area, roughly according to where we live, and we need to organize along workplace lines. So if we were like a mainly agricultural society, we could probably get by with one layer of organizations, namely according to local area, because we're all essentially working the land, right? But in modern day sort of industrial societies, we have these massive industrial organizations that it makes sense to organize the steel industry in its own way, organize the health sector in its own way. And then the most sensible thing is usually what various strands of anarcho-syndicalism come up with, which is you organize both according to workplaces or the economic structures, and you organize by local areas. A third way you can look at this is which I think is historically not given as much emphasis under the official terms means ends coherence, prefigurative politics, as I would like in the socialist movement, although they do talk about and think about these things under other headings, as it were, which is we need to think about the substantive social relations within our institutions. So if we have a formally very democratic decision-making structure, but de facto some people are ignored all the time, they're spoken down to, they're expected to do, for example, also reproductive labor, they're expected to do way more of what are considered disempowering tasks or meaningful or not particularly meaningful or important tasks. They're de facto excluded from most things most of the time. Then even if you have perfect formal institutions, the actual social relations we have won't be particularly free and they won't be particularly equal, at least for a very significant portion of members and or potential members. And that's something that I think many movements, Marxist, anarcho-syndicalists, pay much more attention to now than they used to in the past. And I think that's very important.
That's really interesting and really related to, I think, that tyranny of structurelessness, which I think Javi and Katie and I just sort of talked a little bit about yesterday, where sometimes we sort of pretend that there aren't any hierarchies, like there aren't any of these typical power dynamics going on that actually are still there. And as you said, like people are still expected to behave in certain ways. Some people are actually taking the lead, taking charge, and it's not sort of acknowledged, and it can be a little bit more pernicious than if it was just explicitly said, this person's like the leader and this person, you're all like somehow subordinate or something like that. So I think it's sort of related and quite interesting.
You gotta make the seat to be super hot, that nobody wants to be in that seat for long,
Get out of it.
It's gotta be a hot ass seat. Like you gotta make the leadership like a fucking burden. So everybody's gotta, okay, you take it. I don't want it, But there has to be someone there, But not all the time. Not to gain power and eliminate like philosophically the concept of power being a pleasure in itself, which is something that it's stuck in our fucking melons in here, because we're educated in the freaking capitalist bullshit, all the neoliberal frame of mind in which power this common sentence, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's like, no, I mean, it does corrupt, and we would say that the term corrupt would be like a deterrent to say, okay, then let's not grab power. But then again, it gives pleasure to people. So we need to make power unpleasant. Like the power of decision, saying you're deciding shit for people, but that's going to create a burden on you. You're accountable too, And when power is accountable, it's like, okay, you got to be there because you got a job to do, but you don't want to be there for long, and then you step down and let somebody else take over. And of course, unrepresented, let's say in the context of today, unrepresented people, like let's say women, people of color, people from the global south in general, philosophies coming from the native peoples, let's say, and indigenous philosophies. They really need to come up on top and say, this voice is prevalent, trans, queer people, and and leave. I mean, the philosophy of leave no one behind and make power to be like very unpleasant, like a burden, like a job that somebody's got to do it, but you don't have to do it for long, and somebody will take over, but with like you said, like Red Paul, like you said, like with agreed principles, like a constitutional values that could be like even philosophical in a way. Like they need to carry a culture with it, a culture of respect, of solidarity, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially the tyranny of structurelessness, it's responding to a problem that parts of the sort of anti-authoritarian feminist movement had at a very particular point in time, in particular in the US, where they attempted to avoid hierarchical structures by not having many formal decision-making structures in a number of organizations. And I think for the reasons she lays out, that turns out not necessarily to solve all your problems. Because it doesn't, right? Decisions still get made, they just get made in unaccountable, untransparent ways. Like you have a group and you can either not make a decision and therefore not do anything, or you can make decisions, and then the question is, how do you make decisions? Actually, the recommendations she has are many of them exactly the kinds of things that people had already been doing in anarchist syndicalist movements for almost a century. So her recommendations are, for example, delegation of specific authority, making sure those who have been delegated are made responsible to those who selected them, distributing positions of authority when you have them, like having delegates among as many people as you can, rotating frequently, and so on. And then also taking care to diffuse information among the whole membership. I think that is tremendously important because it points to the important thing that you can have sort of oppressive features or oppressive social relations and practices, even if you don't have formal decision-making institutions that are really sort of well laid out. But I also think, and this is important to remember, that it's not actually a response to the problems of the historical attempts at many historical attempts at organizing in non-authoritarian, non-hierarchical ways among, for example, left Marxists, among anarchists, among syndicalists, because they didn't organize in the ways that she's criticizing, and they also were already implementing many of the features she actually recommends.
Yeah, Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Paul. Number one.
No. You jump in. You go ahead. I've been talking a load of shite this time, so you jump in there.
No, I was just wondering, I think that one of the main questions that a lot of people have when you talk about prefigurative politics is the idea of how realistic it is. And I think that I just wondered what you would respond to that, because I think it's based on, we don't have that much time left with climate change, how prefigurative politics sounds like it would take a lot of time, and people say, we just need to get on the streets and cause mass violence and like overthrow the system, and that prefigurative politics often kind of like detracts away from doing that. At least I think that's how the argument goes. And then there's also the thing of, well, can people be trusted to be making decisions? Like, should everyone have a say equally? A lot of people always talking about people are ignorant, people are apathetic. if everyone's sort of making these decisions collectively, can they really be trusted to make the right decision, kind of thing? Or should we always structure things this way? And then there's also the idea that about whether it's realistic, because if we have organizations structured like that, then there's always going to be someone that wants to abuse the power and go on top and whatever. And we need, then people are often saying, especially people that believe in like a vanguard, that's much better for getting things done and much more of a realistic way of doing things. And I don't believe these things, but I'm just saying, what would your response be to a lot of these types of criticisms or questions?
Yeah, so there was a lot there, and I think it's all important. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer it all right now.
Sorry, yeah, it's a lot of questions at once.
No, but if I miss one, just come back to it later on, please, and I'll try to deal with it then. What should I do first? Yeah, I think in general we should take an open and pragmatic approach here, right? Like, there are certain things that matter, and there are certain things that matter even if they don't necessarily help take us towards revolution. So even before there's a revolution, if it happens, we need, it matters whether we have a better or worse public healthcare system, for example. It matters whether we have slightly better or slightly worse wages and conditions and such. Although we do also want a long-term revolution for various structural reasons, i.e. the capitalist class will tend to roll these things back as much as it can. And only revolution will take us to a future society in which that's no longer the case, and in which we'll actually be free, be able to run our own societies, and not have the capitalist class constantly fighting to worsen our lives. Now, these are important things. So if you just look at reforms, so we're actually going to go through this in the state video that we have, because the problem with prefigurative politics is, given how wide it's been used, it's compatible with, in certain forms, taking state power. So, for example, 21st century socialists, many contemporary Maoists that I mentioned, they also advocate taking state power. They just also think that we need prefigurative politics, that the state can help to nurture in certain kinds of ways, and that we need social movements that are powerful and that have a degree of autonomy from political parties to sort of counteract the extra parliamentary power that capital already wields over us. And this is partly based on a critical analysis of Second International Social Democratic Marxism, which didn't do this.
Wait, sorry, can I just clarify? So does that mean that you can have someone in power, there can be these hierarchies, it's just that it's prefiguratively decided who is that person in power, if that makes sense?
Interestingly not. So, okay, so let's look at the model of 21st century socialism that Michael Leibowitz and Marta Harnecker lay out. They're slightly different in how optimistic they are about the Venezuelan state. We don't need to get into that now, but the basic idea is, initially Chavez actually didn't really have a single party backing him initially, but what they want is a political party that presumably is organized like standard political parties and not necessarily very non-hierarchical. They win an election, they take over the existing, again, capitalist hierarchical state, and the idea that they want to do is they want to use the state to legalize and to aid the creation of a non-capitalist social economy that is run by which is self-organized and self-managed by workers themselves, and alongside that also help empower a network of local community councils, which in Venezuela are called the Bolivarian councils, which are also, again, the local communities self-organized from the bottom up. And the idea is that you will use a non-prefigurative institution, so the capitalist state you've inherited and taken over, in order to grow and nurture and support prefigurative institutions, i.e. the local bottom-up councils and the social economy, and that eventually these prefigurative institutions will take over both economic and political functions, and the existing capitalist state will gradually wither away. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. Could I just hear your? I know you have a little bit more to say on that, but I'd actually really like to hear your opinions on that idea, because I'm very interested in that, and I haven't heard either of these perspectives before. So I'd really like to hear what your thoughts are on it, as well as presenting there. Would that be okay?
can I ask you to keep that thought, because I want to get back to the reforms question, because I think
I'll
that's
put it on a
super
shelf.
important.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. So with respect to taking time and everything, it's like, yes, building prefigurative institutions does take a certain amount of time. Now, they can spring up relatively quickly and get quite a lot done. So an example would be the revolution in Rojava, which before the collapse of the Syrian state in the region had been organizing for a few years, but only really a few years on like a neighborhood assembly type level. And once the sort of civil war really set in and the Syrian state collapsed in the area, they were able to take over and run society very, very effectively in a very short space of time. So that's in terms of, it can only take a couple of years to really get enough training and enough organizing to be able to do quite a lot. Now, they went on to also create a state-like institution, and it gets very complicated. But just in terms of like, can these institutions be developed relatively rapidly and then also do very effective things quite fast? It seems to be the case. In terms of winning reforms, I want to make the point that building a political party takes a long, long time as well. There are very few examples of any kind of like standard Third International or Second International party taking power without, I want to say, decades of organizing really systematically and very sort of through a lot of hard work to be able to get in a position where they can do that. I'm thinking about the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Russian Revolution. They all those parties, I believe, had decades of organizing behind them before they were able to do that. At least one decade. I might be wrong, but I think they had quite a lot of time before the revolutions happened. So that's one thing. Taking over the state also typically takes a long time as well. I won't say that those who reject taking state power, they typically advocate winning reforms through direct action, and that can happen relatively rapidly, right? Whether you're prefiguring or not, right? So just recently, you saw like teacher strikes in the US. You saw that the Fight for 15 campaigns and a bunch of other things have won very significant reforms after just a couple of years of struggle, if not less. And there's a traditional way that actually people come to reject Marxism before the Russian Revolution. And the traditional way they become anarchists and syndicalists rather than Marxists is they look at what the Marxist parties are doing, like building a party, standing for election, and they look at what the syndicalist unions are doing. And they see that syndicalist unions are managing to organize in ways that win reforms very effectively, very rapidly through direct action. And they don't, in their view, see anything similar happening on the social democratic, that is the Second International Marxist side of things. So that's how people like Lucy Parsons, Koto Kosciuszko, and others shift from being quite interested in sort of socialism very broadly to becoming more specifically anarchists or syndicalists. Now, this massively changes after 1917, when the Russian Revolution becomes sort of the model that many others try to implement, but also modify for their own purposes. And anarchism, partly as a result of repression and also partly as a result of the popularity of Third International Marxism, really then takes a massive backseat from then on. So in terms of winning reforms, it seems to be the case that direct action can win, whether it's prefigurative or not, right? The question is really, what do political parties add to this process, right? So can you use a political party to aid it, to make it more effective, which is one of the traditional orthodox Marxist views. And here the history is very, very difficult to pick apart. So you can find examples of major reforms being won without there being a political party involved that's particularly sympathetic to them. There are numerous examples of that. Everything from like Spain winning the 8-hour day, so the Spanish CNT winning the 8-hour day through a general strike, through a bunch of recent teacher strikes in the US. There are also examples of large direct action movements that do support parties winning massive, large-scale changes, like most of European social democracy would be an example of that. Well, then you have the two things coming together. The tricky thing is, can we find examples of major reforms being won by a political party, whether it calls itself Marxist or not, but like by a socialist political party winning an election without a strong and powerful direct action movement behind it? And I have yet to find a good example of that. We do have examples of socialist parties winning elections and then betraying their causes, right? So like the Social Democrats in Germany famously attacked the workers' councils and killed their left-wing leaders like Rosa Luxemburg and I believe Karl Liebknecht as well. And you also have examples of socialist parties taking power and not so much killing anyone, but betraying all their promises, like most recently Syriza. But again, I don't know all the history because I don't think anyone really does. So I'd be really interested if anyone can find examples of a socialist party managing to win significant reforms without the backing and without the activity of a strong direct action movement. What else? I think those are the main things. Do you want to come back on anything I missed, Kathrin? And then after that, I can turn to primary Paul's question.
I guess the question of whether everyone can be trusted to make decisions, in if everyone should have an equal say on making vote on different decision-making processes, or whether there should be. I guess you already sort of answered that though, because it doesn't necessarily. You said it can be one person in power making the decision. It just has to be decided by everyone that person is the expert to decide it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think this essentially comes down to, so in general, I want this kind of like this sort of what's called a federal model of organizing that I laid out before with mandated delegates, etc. And then the follow-up question is, okay, well, at which level do you make kind of which decisions? So I think there are some decisions that just belong, and so I think the general principle for deciding that is essentially who's affected by that decision, or who's most strongly affected by that decision. So if it's like a really personal thing that mainly just affects you, like, I don't know, like which jumper you wear or something, like in any society, the appropriate level of making that decision is the individual, because you're the one primarily affected by that. When it comes to, for example, a local unit, so like, I don't know, the London chapter of a particular organization, if they're making a decision about what to do in London, but that doesn't really affect the organization as a whole, the appropriate unit of decision making for that decision is probably the London chapter of the organization. But if it's something affecting the organization as a whole, then the appropriate level at which to make the decision is the level of the organization as a whole. With respect to trusting people to have power, I think that's a really important thing, right? So I think the most discussions of this kind of bottom-up formal decision-making procedures are premised on the idea that we actually can't trust, uniquely good individuals. It's premised on the idea that if we get put in certain social relations, those social relations will change us. So Bakunin has a famous line, like, you put the most ardent anarchist on the throne of all the Russias, and within a year they'll become just as despotic as any Russians are, no matter how like wonderfully anarchist their principle might initially have been. And one of the traditional arguments for organizing in much more bottom-up ways is based on this kind of praxis idea. It's, you don't want to just trust a few particularly good individuals to have power over everything else, because if you do, they will end up becoming de facto kind of oligarchs. They'll come to tend to see their power as like necessary, inevitable, and a good thing. They will tend to sympathize with other groups in society that have a lot of power over others. And they will tend over time to act against things that would undermine their relative power, wealth, and privilege that comes along with that. And thus, long term, they will tend to come to work against popular empowerment and against bringing about much more free, equal, and democratic sort of social relations and institutions. So these kinds of ways of organizing are typically premised on saying, no, we can't just trust particularly good individuals. We have to find ways that enable groups of people to self-govern themselves in ways that don't rely on just giving power to single individuals.
Okay, but if, for example, there were four scientists in a group of 100 people and they were experts on some scientific issue, it would still be okay to maybe give those four people the opportunity to decide on what happens to like in a science. I don't know, it's a bad example, but they need some important science knowledge, and those four people make that decision because they have the knowledge, whereas the rest of the people wouldn't know so much about that. So it can still work in those kind of ways.
So that, I'm not entirely sure how a future society would organize that in the best possible way. But I do want to make the point that in sort of much of the medical sector these days, we don't actually do that, right? We often let patients have a huge amount of choice in whether they accept treatments, even if they're definitely medically the best. And we have really important laws regarding like consent and autonomy for patients, precisely because doctors left to their own devices historically have done a number of awful things to patients when given absolute power over them in many situations.
I would also say that there are no experts in how to operate a society. That's there's no such thing as a leadership in that kind of knowledge.
Mm,
Yeah, I want to make a distinction between like it might be the case that the scientists know best, and that therefore it would be a great idea if most people listened to them and followed their advice when they may say national level or international level decisions about say healthcare policy. But I think ultimately, because these things affect the society as a whole or affect loads of people as a whole, they are the ones who have to make the decision. Either in some cases as individuals, whether I accept a particular cancer treatment or not, for example, or on the level of society as a whole, like which kind of healthcare policy is appropriate for that society.
I guess I'm thinking the science was maybe a bad example, but I was thinking, for example, if there were two people of color in a group of 100 people, and then they were making a decision on discrimination, for example, based on race. And naturally, I would assume that it would make more sense for those two people of color to have more of a say in that situation. But then, if what they were asking for was something that the rest of the people in the organization weren't happy with, I don't know. I'm just thinking about these types of situations where it gets a bit more complicated with decision making, how that would operate.
I also have concerns about that as well, especially when we have like such a depoliticized society, you know, at the pres as we have at the present. Now we have a rapidly politicizing population generally, basically globally at the moment. But I do think we run into these issues time and time again, and I don't want to get like too much into that. You know, oh, we'll have specialists who will do absolutely who will assign to absolutely everything, but there's definitely some question marks
But but
that I would
but
have there. You know,
but wouldn't that be like one of the prefigurative tasks to do, like getting away from that shit culture that makes people think backwards?
educate people. Yeah,
Yeah,
educate people and
changing the
bring them
paradigm,
forward.
changing the shitty culture of me, myself, and I. I got mind
Mm-hmm.
fuck you. That's something that we need to get rid of. And yeah, listen to people of oppressed groups in general. We can't have men deciding feminism. We can't have white people deciding on racism. We can't have, you know,
Yeah. That yeah, that is one of the concerns that I do sort of bump up against, like especially when people are really attached to direct democracy in like in this circumstance right now. Like, what if you do? And this is an example that's used by even by like reactionaries and stuff like that, where they'll say like, oh well, what if you have like a group of people who decide that somebody should have the death penalty for being a certain identity or something like that, for being like LGBTQ plus or something like that, and I'm not sure that shit should be up to vote.
also
You know what I mean?
that's why accountable leadership should be for like if the leadership screws up in a say in applying anti-racist policies in a society, then those should be punished for corrected and taken over by someone who's better at those policies, and so on and so forth. The thing is, there's so many vectors to consider, but there's also like there's no one person or one group of people who will lead everything. There has to be like specialized groups in this or that task that should be accountable to their constituencies, if you know what I mean. Then with accountability, all that is gone, because you can't, as a person in charge, quote unquote, in charge, taking decisions. You should not be able to afford, let's say, quote unquote, mistakes, to leave people behind, because what's the purpose? What did we do a revolution for anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, there's a slight difference between where we're talking about movements and organizations now, or or the institutions of a future society, right? In movements and attempts at building sort of transitional institutions, there are a bunch of different ways of trying to deal with this, right? I don't think sort of there is a one size fits all policy here, right? So there are examples of people having, for example, distinct caucuses for women, for people of color, etc., and for having them have certain powers, for example, veto powers over resolutions or particular powers of information and so on, or having a structure whereby they're listened to when it comes to decisions that particularly might affect them, even if it wasn't foreseen that they would affect them because they self-organize. In Rojava, for example, they had a system of dual representation, where for every position there was a man and a woman, sorry, a woman and was that their man or I think it was a woman and a man elected for every position, and they had to have consensus on each issue. And again, I don't think any of these solutions are perfect. There might actually not be any that are perfect, but I think that's something we need to sort of figure out as groups and as organizations and as movements going forward. Because again, if we don't do it, nobody else is going to do it for us. I want to make one sort of brief, sort of general, just logical point about what if these institutions, democratic, bottom up, whatever, make bad decisions, because that's possible no matter which institutions you have. The key question here is who's responsible for them, or rather, who has the power to make and affect those decisions? Do we have a minority who effectively has that power, or do we have a majority or as large a group as possible? And no matter not all minorities and all majorities can make really bad decisions. The question here is like who essentially makes it. But having a majority make a decision doesn't necessarily mean it won't be bad. It's perfectly possible that it'll still be bad. There are certain traditional safeguards involved, whether minority or majority rule is what we're talking about, like having sort of the equivalent of certain constitutions, having various fail-safe mechanisms, demanding super majorities for things that violate certain basic either constitutions or systems of sort of basic principles, having degrees of local autonomy and right of secession if they get treated very badly. And that's particularly relevant for local regions that are, have, for example, traditionally been colonized by other regions. But I don't think any of these guarantee that bad decisions and various kinds of oppressive decisions won't be made. I just think they, as it were, make the odds better. But I also want to make the point that this is a problem, a potential issue that will arise in any kind of organization, whether it's democratically organized or whether it's bottom-up organized or not. I think we have the best odds possible that bad decisions won't be made, or rather we have the best odds possible for the best possible decisions in societies that are sort of self-organized from the bottom up, but there are no guarantees here when it comes to anything that humans do.
Yeah, I think we're doing a leftist in a way. Like, if we are presented with a model, it's like, oh, how can we make this work the best possible in the best possible?
Yeah. I really like that point that you just made, Red Paul, because I think that, that's something that we always get. Oh, you're a socialist or you're a communist. Oh, how does that work? How would you do this? How would you do that? When actually, like, that's a lot of these things. It's so hard to answer. It just depends on what the group decides in that time, and there's no perfect thing. It's just better than any other model that we've seen so far.
One step
or
at a
potentially
time, right?
can be. What was it, Paul, that you had a question about earlier?
Oh, I just wanted to ask what the thoughts were on Venezuela, because Venezuela was brought up, and I wanted to ask a little bit about what Red Paul thought about that. But I think sort of we're probably, I know, Kathrin, you said you didn't have as much time today, you have to run off, so I think we are sort of rounding things up here. One of the big questions I wanted to ask was, Red Paul, what did you think of the Occupy movement? What do you think with the strengths and the weaknesses, and how do you feel that went? Do you think that effectively incorporated prefigurative politics? And so maybe what you think about these sort of modern iterations or modern attempts at building these kinds of progressive, left-wing, socialist-ish social movements, anyway, at least. So maybe just Venezuela and Occupy. I know there's a lot to talk about there, but I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on those two particular things.
Sure, I can do that. Venezuela, I have a hard time finding really good detailed information about what's happening the last few years. So I can't say too much like specifically because to be honest, I just don't know. I also like my Spanish is extremely limited and not like I can't like it's not good enough to read the basic newspaper articles. So I can't really find through Spanish language information, and I don't find much really good detailed stuff in English from the last few years. So I have a hard time really getting good information, so I can't say. My general issue with Venezuela, so so personally, I would very much prefer to believe that a sort of mix between social movements and political parties taking state power are the most feasible way to go. So I really look for evidence that would help confirm that, and I can't really find very much of that evidence. So I really want to believe encouraging things both on municipal levels and on national levels, but I can't actually find much evidence to support that. Sadly, in one way, I guess. I mean, reality is just what it is, but still. Um, I also have very strong long-term doubts about what the effects of taking state power tend to be on the organizations that and the individuals who take that state power, because there's a lot of history behind it. And yeah, so I'm very skeptical about the long-term prospects for revolution and massive social change. Although I do, of course, hope for the best for everyone involved. Actually, there's one thing that's quite interesting there, though, because even if, say, kind of a worst-case scenario, the party betrays all of its principles and just goes like full, I don't know, like neoliberal or something, which all the European social democratic parties did. Even if that happens, they've still constructed a bunch of institutions through which people are used to self-organizing in certain ways. And I want to make an important point about the Russian Revolution, because one of the things that enabled the Russian Revolution to happen once the Petrograd Soviet carried out the initial coup, was that there were a bunch of institutions around the entire country, like the peasant commune, like the Soviets, and to some extent the workers' council, but mainly the Soviets and the peasant communes, through which people had been used to self-organizing in various very imperfect ways that enabled them to rise up and take over control and carry out the revolution. And this is important because we have to remember the revolution was one thing, the Bolshevik Party is another. The Bolshevik Party was tiny and had effectively no support in the countryside, but the revolution spread throughout the Russian countryside very, very rapidly. And it had nothing to do with the Bolshevik Party being popular there because they weren't. They were largely unknown. It has to do with the fact that they were used to self-organizing and were willing to carry out the revolution when they did. So even if the party betrays everything in Venezuela, the fact that these institutions have been built might still hold some useful promise. That was one thing. Occupy. Yeah, I mean, I have sort of mixed views on Occupy. I was part of it. In general, I have quite strong doubts about the usefulness of consensus decision making. I think it can work for small groups of people, like sort of affinity groups, or people who are part of a small local community that all sort of know each other and are committed to making everything function. I think for large-scale organizations where people have different goals, different strategies, don't know each other, don't necessarily share a lot in common, consensus decision making requiring consensus to make decisions is really ineffective. So I think that was one of the sad things, is that became sort of the model that most of the Occupy movement adhered to, and that it didn't work very well for making decisions. I think the Occupy movement has had two tremendously positive effects for the development of the world, especially in sort of Europe and North America, because those are the regions sort of I see the effects to some extent. One is they've had a massive consciousness raising effects in terms of critiques of capitalism, like discussions of class power, class oppression, and of capitalism in a critical light, massively expanded as right after Occupy, and have kept going. And it's not clear to me that would have happened without Occupy. It wasn't happening before Occupy much at all, and I think that's very important. A second thing, which we saw in some of the occupations happening towards the end, were attempts to link in with the labor movement. And I think one of the things we see in the sort of resurging radical labor movement in various parts of the world, but especially the parts where Occupy were big, is part of the after effects of Occupy. Many of those people were initially part of Occupy and were sort of radicalized during Occupy. In terms of what the Occupy actually did in terms of winning reforms and everything, I don't really think it achieved much of that. I also have my doubts whether it ever would have been able to, no matter what people did. Because you had a bunch of extremely diverse group of young people, many who've never organized in any significant way before, with all sorts of different political beliefs, goals, values, commitments, ideas about strategy. Um, and I'm not entirely, I don't know whether it would have been possible to organize them and to actually do much more effective stuff than happened in Occupy. So I think, yeah, in brief, Occupy has had two major, very positive effects, which is revitalizing the radical labor movement and to some extent community movements. And secondly is massive consciousness raising effect in terms of capitalism, class, and class power. There's also links between Occupy and the development of Black Lives Matter, which gonna get the name right. Kianga Yamata Taylor in the book from hashtag Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, I think it's called, goes through in some detail. But yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. That was brilliant. Thanks very much for going into that. Very interesting to hear your takes on those, and it's nice to hear sort of the positive takeaways from Occupy, because I mean, yeah, it did kind of fizzle out, but it centered that 99% versus the 1%. It centered that old almost proletariat versus bourgeoisie. Maybe not quite as nuanced, but
Yeah, they got the ball rolling, right?
They got the ball rolling. Yeah.
It was not the revolution. Nobody would be so, but
Yeah.
it kind
Absolutely.
of stopped a little bit the rhetorics of the best of possible worlds and the end of history and bullshit like that. So let's give it that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, you go.
No, I was just going to ask another question. So if you want to say more about Occupy.
No, by all means, go for it.
I guess I just wanted to ask what you thought about this whole idea of leftist unity, because I think that at the moment, there are a lot of people calling for leftist unity, but then they often get very shut down I don't know, it's only something that people believe if they don't know that much about politics or know that much about theory. And just wanted to know what you thought about leftist unity, since you want to sort of write a book about the synthesizing Marxism and anarchism. Do you believe in leftist unity?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by left unity, right? Because it tends to mean slightly different things in slightly different situations. Especially online, because very many sort of participants in online discussion that I've seen, they make very specific assumptions, and they're often not the same ones. So they might be arguing past each other, not necessarily with each other. But I guess in some ways, so in terms of working together in, say, for example, class-based or gender-based or sort of local area-based or whatever kinds of organizations, I think left unity is like already a reality in many places, and that's sort of just fine, right? And there's also a long history of this. You have like unions like the IWW in the United States organized a bunch of like anarchists and Marxists and others to work for and win lots of major reforms and be part of very important struggles, even though they disagreed about many other things. And that's the history of many organizations in many parts of the world for a long time. And I think I see some of that in the sort of more radical labor movements and community movements and other movements as well today, right? There are very often many different strands of leftists who are able to work together very productively in these organizations and these movements. There are, however, certain kinds of strategies that are incompatible with each other long term. So, for example, if you take there's a traditional like social democratic Marxist view that you need these sort of, for example, unions that are essentially under the command of a single centralized party and do what the party tells them to do. If that's your strategy, it's going to be hard to work very productively and to agree too much with somebody who says that's suicide for a bottom-up movement to do that. And there are certain times at which, if you're looking long-term towards like the actual revolution, it really matters what people do and what people don't do, right? So one of the things that happened, for example, during the Spanish Revolution was that the anarchist CNT decides to give up on standard anarchist strategy and join in the government, leave the army and their militia units under government command, which in long term, as we now know, of course, enables the Communist Party on Stalin's orders and the Republicans, but mainly the Communist Party on Stalin's orders, to betray the anarchists and other Marxists. The POUM were also sort of screwed over by this, to betray the revolution, attack them in turn, like physically, like attack them with their parts of the army, which eventually leads to the victory of fascism. Another example would be the Ukrainian Revolution during the Russian Revolution, where again the anarchist armies under Nestor Makhno liberate large parts of Ukraine, and they're invited to a meeting with the Red Army where they try to assassinate all of them. A few of them escape, Makhno included. And of course, there are other examples, like when the Council Communist uprising happens in Germany, led by the left Marxists. It's the Social Democrats that betray them and murder them, right, by sending in private mercenary forces and the police and so on. So there comes a time when it's hard to have too much unity if your strategies are fundamentally misaligned, and there's a history of one side murdering the other. But in terms of working on like mass movements that are winning reforms in the present, I think there's a lot of productive work that can be done, and that is worth doing.
Damn, that's a really great answer. I really like it. All your answers have been so great. Yeah, you're very knowledgeable about this stuff. So yeah, I don't know. If you have any other questions or anything else you want to say before we go?
I think we should wrap it up with that story that you wanted to share with us and on how you people met.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
That'd be cool.
Oh yeah, me and Paul, we go way back. Well, basically I don't know, Paul came in to be like a guest lecturer at my university in my class, and I didn't know that who Paul was at all. So I had watched Red Plateaus. I keep saying Plateaus, it's Plateau, the channel, and I'd commented on your videos and stuff like that, but I had no idea what you looked like. So I was just asking loads of questions about prefigurative politics in this class whilst you were giving a really good rundown of everything about prefigurative politics, and then at the end, Paul was like, "Oh, are you Kathrin?" And I was like, "Oh, how do you know who I am?" And yeah, that was it really. But it was just such a random place to meet in my classroom at university as a guest lecturer kind of thing.
Yeah, it was weird. I walk in and I'm like distracted and stuff because I have to do the thing of like talking to people and people. I was like, she looks vaguely familiar. And I'm like a little bit nearsighted, so I don't necessarily recognize people like super well when they're a little bit like more than a few meters away from me, and I'm too stubborn to like get glasses because like the mixture of being stubborn and lazy is like really inconvenient. Basic things like that. But then she asked questions. I was like, it probably is. And it turns out to be, But it's just weird meeting like people you only know on YouTube in like real life.
And in such random places as well. I didn't think I'd meet someone in my classroom from YouTube. So yeah, that was really cool. Yeah. And it's also good to have someone who lives in the same city as you that also does YouTube. So because normally it's quite an isolating thing to do, I guess, because not many people of your friends and family really get what you're doing, and most people think it's a bit weird. So like to have people who live near you who get it is really nice, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're gonna wrap this up, good people. Paul, if you wanna have some final words, wrap it up or plug something or say, anything that you want to say for closing the stream.
Okay. I guess first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Love your stuff. Keep making it, please, everyone.
Thanks.
And you. It's amazing.
For listeners and viewers, check out the channel if you're interested in sort of Marx and stuff, especially. The channel is Red Plateaus. We made a mistake with the name because we only realized afterwards that nobody can actually spell the name, including us. So I'm sure there's a bunch of people are just calling us Red Plateaus, which is a way better name, and I wish that name.
You still have time. It's
change
still use the
name.
RP.
Maybe we should, because the acronym is the same. Maybe I'll talk to Ivan and see what we can do. A proud and noble creature, and we will be honored to be named after.
Yeah, just a platypus with that little fist that you have in your icon there. Yeah,
We actually
not?
have like a little like a cat drawing that this one like visual artist made for us. But maybe we can make. Well, we'll see. We'll see.
turn it into a
Anyway,
platypus.
Red Plateaus. You can find us. Red Plateaus. You can find us on YouTube. I also have like a co-written book called Prefigurative Politics: Building Tomorrow Today. You can find it like wherever. Just Google, like go into like a book thing and search for Prefigurative Politics. You will find it. It's the only monograph on it so far. And I have a couple of friends who are going to write some as well. It's going to be cool. Yeah, I don't have anything else to add really, but thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, thank you for coming on.
It's great.
Okay, good
For
people,
educating us.
and thank you to everybody in the chat and everybody who joined live, and thank you to everybody who's gonna watch this after the fact. Links for Red Plateau are in the description, and I tried to figure out a link for the book as well and put it there. It's not there right now, but one thing at a time. Thank you all for coming. So good to hang out with you. Another Socialist Sunday stream. As usual,
Thank you.
relaxed, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Enjoy the weekend.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
See yous.